Mrs. Maria was a woman of strong presence, with silver hair that caught the light and eyes that still sparkled with the intensity of a life full of battles. From a young age, she had learned to be independent, facing every obstacle with resilience and an unbreakable spirit. She raised her children, built her life with her own hands, and never let challenges extinguish her dreams, even if some remained tucked away for years. Now, at 80 years old, Mrs. Maria felt it was time to fulfill a long-held wish, to treat herself to something special, a gift that would symbolize a life well lived. She wanted a brand new car, sleek, shiny, and powerful, a symbol of her achievements. To her, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a reward for her dedication, a testament to the story she had written with her own perseverance. With this decision made, Mrs. Maria researched local dealerships. She wasn't looking for just any car, she wanted something that reflected her spirit. She envisioned an experience that celebrated who she was and the strength that had carried her through life. That's why she chose a luxury car dealership, imagining that from the moment she walked in, she would be met with respect and care befitting a woman who had honored every chapter of her life. That morning, Mrs. Maria dressed in her best outfit, carefully styled her hair, and left behind a faint trace of her favorite perfume. Each step toward the dealership brought memories of her journey, sacrifices, sleepless nights, and the satisfaction of each milestone. As she walked through the dealership's glass doors, her heart quickened. This moment felt like a long-awaited indulgence, and she anticipated being greeted with the dignity her story deserved. But little did she know, the welcome awaiting her was far from the kindness she had hoped for. As Mrs. Maria stepped into the showroom, her eyes lit up at the sight of the luxury cars on display. Their sleek designs and gleaming finishes mirrored the dreams she had held onto for so long. For a brief moment, she let herself be immersed in this world of sophistication, a world she was finally ready to claim as her own. But as she wandered through the showroom, soaking in every detail, an uncomfortable sensation crept in. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the quick glances and whispered remarks among the staff. Two sharply dressed salesmen exchanged knowing looks, smirking as if sharing a private joke. One even raised an eyebrow, his expression tinged with disdain, as if silently questioning what an elderly woman was doing in a place filled with cars of such grandeur. A young employee, seemingly new to the job, observed Mrs. Maria with a hint of curiosity but said nothing. The others, however, seemed to view her presence as out of place, an intrusion in an environment they believed was reserved for the elite. Her modest appearance didn't align with their expectations for someone looking to purchase a luxury car. Mrs. Maria, with her wealth of life experience, quickly picked up on their judgment. Yet, as always, she carried herself with poise. She lifted her chin and walked with quiet dignity, running her fingers gently over the cool metal of one of the cars. She admired the vehicles with the respect of someone who understood their value, not just their price tag but the meaning they held. She knew she could afford the car and, more importantly, she deserved it. The staff, however, remained trapped in their assumptions. To them, she was just an elderly woman with no real business being there, a distraction, not a potential client. They failed to see the determined woman before them, one who had overcome far greater judgments in her life and who was resolute in proving her worth. One of the salesmen, a tall, impeccably dressed man, approached Mrs. Maria with an expression that barely concealed his indifference. As he neared her, he cast a quick glance in her direction without truly meeting her eyes, as though fulfilling a chore rather than extending a courtesy. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone flat and disinterested. Mrs. Maria, her enthusiasm unshaken, responded with a warm smile and inquired about one of the showroom's most prominent models. She wanted to know about its performance, comfort, and safety features, but the salesman provided only the bare minimum of information, treating her questions as though they were unimportant. "This is one of our most expensive models," the salesman emphasized, subtly trying to dissuade her. "Perhaps you'd like to take a look at something more affordable?" His tone was almost as if he were offering friendly advice, but in truth, he didn't believe for a moment that she was there to buy anything. Mrs. Maria tried to assert herself, explaining that she genuinely wanted to learn more about the car and its features. But every time she attempted to engage in a serious conversation, the salesman responded with impatience and curt answers, clearly aiming to end the interaction quickly. "Look, ma'am, we have other models in the other section," he said, vaguely gesturing toward the opposite side of the showroom. "Maybe you'll find something there that's more suitable." At that moment, Mrs. Maria realized he didn't believe she could buy anything from the dealership, let alone the luxury car she was interested in. The humiliation stung, but she took a deep breath and maintained her composure. She didn't need to prove anything to him. Yet, she made a quiet decision right then and there. They would see just how big her dreams were, and how capable she was of making them a reality. Mrs. Maria walked slowly toward the dealership's door, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor as the indifferent salesman turned to attend to another customer. The weight of the humiliation grew heavier with each step. She glanced around, her eyes lingering on the gleaming luxury cars under the bright lights. These weren't just vehicles, they were symbols of achievement and status. And she, an 80-year-old woman with a humble appearance, didn't seem to belong in that world. She paused at the door, her trembling hands clutching her handbag tightly. Outside, the sun shone brightly, but inside, she felt a shadow of sadness. For a moment, shame almost made her turn away, vowing never to think about this again. But instead, something different stirred within her heart, a mix of indignation and frustration. Why should she be judged by appearances rather than by who she truly was? The condescending glances, the way they treated her, it all made her reflect deeply. Why shouldn't she have the right to indulge in buying a new car? Why was the world so quick to judge someone without knowing their story? She took a deep breath. This wasn't how things would end. This wasn't the final word. Mrs. Maria resolved that she would respond in a way they wouldn't forget. The humiliation wouldn't defeat her, it would strengthen her. She knew what she was capable of. And if they saw her as just a simple, modest woman, they would soon regret underestimating her. She would return stronger than ever. And this time she would surprise them all. Back at home, Mrs. Maria sat on her sofa, still feeling the weight of the disdain she had faced at the dealership. Every detail of the experience replayed in her mind, fueling her sense of injustice. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting a sense of calm wash over her. This wasn't the end of the story, she knew that. Something within her refused to accept this as a defeat. She was strong, determined, and had a lifetime of overcoming challenges to prove it. With a renewed glimmer in her eyes, Mrs. Maria stood up and began planning her next steps. This wouldn't just be about buying a luxury car, it would be about teaching those who doubted her a lesson they wouldn't forget. She picked up the phone and made a few calls, organizing her resources. She gathered her documents, reviewed her finances, and made sure every detail was in place. Mrs. Maria knew that when she returned, it wouldn't simply be about the car. It would be a statement to those who had judged her unfairly, a message that appearances don't define a person's worth. With everything prepared, she looked toward the door, feeling her anxiety give way to confidence. This time, no one would underestimate her. She would return with her head held high and her heart steady. After all, Mrs. Maria's worth was far greater than anyone could imagine. Days later, Mrs. Maria walked back into the dealership with firm steps and a determined expression. Her clothes were simple, but her posture spoke volumes. She was someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Her composed demeanor and confident gaze made it clear she was not the same woman who had left Humiliated days before. Every movement she made was a quiet declaration of strength and dignity. As she crossed the threshold, the whispers among the staff began almost immediately. They recognized her and exchanged surprised glances, wondering why she had returned. The same salesman who had treated her with indifference looked at her again, this time with a mix of disdain and unease. Mrs. Maria ignored every glance and comment. She made her way to the center of the showroom with a purpose that left no room for hesitation. She knew this moment was about more than just a purchase, it was a statement. Every second she spent there was an opportunity to prove that no one could define her worth by her appearance or age. The salesman finally approached her, this time attempting to mask his discomfort with a forced smile. "Oh, you're back, ma'am? Can I help you with something?" His voice carried a hint of sarcasm, as though he still doubted her intentions. Mrs. Maria met his gaze calmly and replied with firm conviction. "Yes, I'd like to finalize the purchase of one of the vehicles I looked at during my last visit. Could you please show me the model I requested?" The salesman tried to hide his surprise, but his widened eyes betrayed him. Mrs. Maria's confidence left him momentarily speechless. Though he stumbled through his response, she remained poised, her head held high, and her steady gaze made it clear she was there to finish what she had started. Mrs. Maria's return wasn't just a visit, it was an act of affirmation. Everyone there began to realize that this woman was far more than she appeared to be. When she declared her intention to buy the most expensive car in the showroom, Mrs. Maria shifted the entire atmosphere. The staff, who had previously dismissed or mocked her, were now stunned. Their faces showed a mix of shock and embarrassment as they processed the bold move made by this seemingly humble woman. No one had expected her to return, let alone make such a commanding statement. The salesman she had spoken to earlier seemed particularly uneasy. His tense smile and stiff demeanor betrayed his discomfort. "Are you sure, ma'am?" he asked hesitantly, still grasping for some semblance of control. Mrs. Maria locked eyes with him and replied without a moment's hesitation, "I'm absolutely sure. I've spent my entire life working hard, and now it's only fair that I enjoy the luxury I've earned." Her words echoed through the showroom, carrying a quiet strength. It wasn't arrogance, but the self-assurance of someone who knew her worth and refused to be underestimated. Some of the staff, who had been snickering behind her back just days earlier, now exchanged uneasy glances, realizing how unjust they had been. The salesman, visibly flustered, stammered, "Oh, of course, ma'am. We'll make sure you have the best experience possible." But Mrs. Maria wasn't done. "The best experience?" she repeated with a slight ironic smile. "Interesting, because the last time I was here, you all made me feel as if I didn't belong. Well, I think we've all learned a valuable lesson today." A heavy silence filled the showroom. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her presence and her words, laden with meaning, were enough to make everyone stop and reflect. In that moment, every staff member understood that true elegance wasn't about material possessions. It was about character. Mrs. Maria walked confidently toward the dealership's most luxurious car as the room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. Without hesitation, she pointed to the vehicle and confirmed her choice. "That one. This exact model?" The staff, especially the salesman who had been dismissive, stood tensely, each one acutely aware of their role in the day's embarrassment. As the purchase process unfolded, the dealership's manager personally came over to hand Mrs. Maria the car keys, his demeanor now humble and respectful. "I deeply apologize for how you were treated, ma'am. I hope we can make amends with this purchase," he said, his voice a mix of regret and gratitude. But Mrs. Maria hadn't come just to buy a car. She knew her visit was an opportunity to impart a lesson money couldn't buy. Holding the key in her hand, she looked directly at the salesman who had once dismissed her. Her voice, calm but firm, carried the wisdom of someone who had lived through life's many trials. "Son, life has a curious way of teaching us what really matters. Today you judged me by my appearance, but respect and dignity are virtues money can't buy, no matter how much someone has in their bank account." The salesman lowered his head, ashamed. Her words struck a chord, and everyone around felt the weight of her message. She continued, "Remember this. Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with kindness, because what we see on the outside never tells the whole story." Mrs. Maria then stepped into her new car, pausing before closing the door to cast one final glance at the staff. "I hope this serves as a lesson for all of us. True wealth lies in character, not in what we show the world." And with that, she drove off, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at a customer, or themselves, the same way again. With those words, she started the engine and drove away from the dealership, leaving behind a reflective silence and a lesson that none of them would ever forget. Mrs. Maria settled into the soft leather seat, her hands brushing against its smooth texture. The luxurious car's engine purred with a combination of power and grace. Looking at her reflection in the rearview mirror, she didn't just see an elderly woman. She saw someone who had triumphed over far more than prejudice in her lifetime. As she began to leave, something unexpected happened. The employees who had ignored her earlier now formed a small corridor along the exit. They stood silently, their expressions filled with regret and respect. At the front of the group was the manager, who raised his hand, signaling a request to approach. He took a deep breath, and his voice, once authoritative, now carried humility and remorse. "Mrs. Maria, please allow me to express our sincere apologies." She stopped the car and lowered the window, her calm but firm gaze meeting the manager and the staff. The manager continued, "We failed to treat you with the respect every person deserves, no matter the circumstances. It was a shameful mistake, and I hope you know we've all learned something important today." His voice trembled, and he bowed his head in a gesture of respect. The salesman who had treated her rudely stepped forward, visibly shaken. "Mrs. Maria, I deeply regret my actions. I hope that one day you can forgive me for my ignorance and prejudice." His sincerity was unmistakable, and it was clear that the lesson had been learned the hard way. Mrs. Maria looked at them all and gave a slight nod, her expression free of resentment. "Life has its ways of teaching us, my children. What matters is that you've learned." Her voice was soft but steady, resonating deeply with everyone present. With that, she gently pressed the accelerator, and the car glided gracefully out of the dealership. As she drove away, some of the staff continued to watch her, feeling that they had been profoundly impacted by an experience that went far beyond selling a car. Each of them knew that something had shifted within. When she arrived home, Mrs. Maria was enveloped by a sense of serenity and fulfillment. The powerful yet silent engine accompanied her thoughts on the journey, like a melody that reflected the harmony now settling in her heart. It wasn't the new car that filled her with satisfaction, though she appreciated its luxury and comfort. It was a symbol, a tip of the iceberg of something much greater. To her, that day represented more than a purchase. It was a victory for respect, a response to the silent, cold prejudice she had faced. Over the years, Mrs. Maria had learned that appearances were deceiving, that what someone shows on the outside is often a superficial layer of a far richer story. And yet, she had been forced to relearn that lesson in a way no one could have anticipated. When she stepped out of the car and glanced at it one last time before entering her home, she smiled softly. She reflected on how many people judge and are judged every day, their stories untold, their struggles unseen. Perhaps, just perhaps, the impact of that day had been powerful enough to ensure that the dealership staff would never forget the lesson they had learned. In her heart, Mrs. Maria hoped that her actions and words would serve as a lasting reminder that respect should be a practice, not just a word. As she walked into her home, she felt that her story in its own way was a message to the world. A person's worth can never be defined by their clothes, their age, or their appearance, but by what they carry within. Did you like the story? Comment below what you thought of this story, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this.